purely practical level, I don't need to bring headphones. I like to bring them just because, I don't know, it feels like a real podcast if I bring the headphones. And I mean, sometimes I do put them on for like monitoring purposes. Okay. Sometimes I don't, because on particular days my head might be real sweaty, and because these are over ear headphones, it gets gross. And wait, I always get this paranoid feeling that I try to eat a lot before I came here, because I have this paranoia about, like, I even brought a lunch because I fear about like getting real hungry in the middle of recording, and I feel like I should have eaten like my cereal bar or something before I started here, but.
Well, you're going to be okay.
I mean, I think it'll be okay.
Okay.
And, although, are you going to end up real hungry?
No,
like
I ate
45
lunch.
Minutes in?
No, I ate lunch before I came. I don't get hungry either. Like some people get, my sister's like that. They get hungry and they can't do anything else but think about food.
Yeah.
I can go for a long time without really feeling deprived. As long as I have a little caffeine so I don't get a headache, I could probably go most of the day without eating, and often do.
That sounds counterintuitive. I think you would, at least to me, having caffeine does give me a headache.
Oh, really?
I think it may be because I haven't become accustomed to drinking caffeine, or like at least as much as in a regular cup of coffee. For some reason, coffee has never hooked me. Because I always find myself wanting to be like, oh, the guy who just gets black coffee because they're just hot black and that's it. Just because like that sounds like hard ass,
right? Yeah,
something like that. But the effect of having had coffee, it leaves me, one, dehydrated, two, kind of my head's kind of swimmy. It eventually does give me a headache because it does dehydrate. And I never wanted to be dependent on something like coffee. It seems like, most 98% of adults are the part of the morning routine is getting coffee and having some to drink in the morning. And I don't, for some reason, it just does not jive with my body and like the routine I have in the morning for some reason.
Well, that's our house, right? That we get up, we have coffee, 2 on the weekends, maybe more, 2 cups. And, it's part of a pleasurable, morning. And then when I'm teaching, I always have to have coffee before I go in the classroom. Have to, it's too strong. Like to. If I teach a morning class, which I haven't done in a long time, but I will again in the fall. So,
how early?
Oh, 9:30. Not bad.
I mean, yeah, that's not bad.
Early it was early for me when I was a college student. Now that I'm an adult and a parent, 9:30 feels like a comfortable time to start school.
Yeah, I got at some point during my life, I got into this mindset where it feels like 8 o'clock is the dividing time. From before 8 o'clock, you could call that early. Then after 8 o'clock is not that early. Do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
No, it's if I were more disciplined in my quest to be more productive, I would call 8 o'clock sleeping in. Waking up at 8 o'clock would be sleeping in. But that hasn't happened yet.
We don't have to in college. I didn't get up early when I was in college.
Well, I did
had to get up,
but because I had to. Right. Like my first semester here back in the fall, I had an introduction to education course that started at 8. I remember the very first day. I was like, oh, it's I've transferred to a new school. It's first day. I'm gonna treat myself. I'm gonna go out and get breakfast before I actually leave to go to class. And it was like 7:20 or something when I was walking out of the restaurant. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go. And Albany Turnpike just turned into a mess, and Bloomfield Avenue even more of a mess. And I think I spent more time inching up Bloomfield Avenue than I did actually driving there. The usually 40-minute drive to get to Hartford, West Hartford. And I remember I parked in C lot, grabbed my things, ran up, tried to find a room. That was the first thing. Trying to find a room, and then it was locked. Although I think that was because the teacher didn't have an actual, or maybe it was because that door just locks after you shut it or something. Like you swipe the card and then unlocks so you can let people in, and then you close it and it's locked again or something.
Right.
But I was that kid standing outside at 8:06 a.m. Looking into the classroom, feeling real shamed.
Right. Well, the first day you get some leeway. Right.
So how you been? What have you been doing?
What have I been doing? I've been reading. I've been writing over the summer, and
that would make sense.
Yeah, those are the things that I really enjoy doing, and am paid to do. So so I try to do that during the summer, like you.
Technically, I pay you to do sort of.
Right. Well, you pay me to teach. I think students pay me to teach. The university pays me to maintain a sort of scholarly profile.
Right.
In addition, so that I am a better teacher, and also so that they can tell other people that smart folks work at the university and they should want to come here. So
yeah.
But the summer is a challenging time. You were saying that trying to stay disciplined and get things done. That struggle is part of my daily struggle. This week, at least, I have been none too productive. I'm reading a book I don't particularly like. I haven't really wanted to write things. I'm planning for vacation. I'm doing parental stuff. So it hasn't been very productive. But up until a couple weeks ago, it was a very productive summer in terms of writing and reading. And I still, what do we have? About a month to go. So yeah. I'll get a little bit more reading done before school starts, and then by mid-August I really transition to more focus on course planning and school stuff as opposed to just research and writing, which you can do in the earlier part of the summer.
Yeah, I gotta start reading more.
Well,
I should be reading more. Being that I'm an English major.
Yeah,
but
I agree. Have you read anything this summer?
Okay, here's the thing. I don't very much read physical books a lot. I used to read a ton, but in recent years, I've felt like my consciousness is so splintered, and I have almost no attention span. And so it's been quite a few years since I've read a real book front to back.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I read, I think, was Bob Dylan's memoir, Chronicles Volume 1, and that one might have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I do consume a lot of audio in a form of podcasts and audiobooks. Mm-hmm. The last thing I read was a book by Neil deGrasse Tyson called Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, which it was good. That was good.
Now, here's a question for you. Why do you think that is that you don't read books, like book-length things, any longer? Like, what has happened to take your attention away from, or to limit your attention span so that's hard to do now?
Being engaged in frivolous media, such as YouTube videos of cats or podcasts or...
Well, podcasts aren't necessarily frivolous. So like I want to decenter that question from saying, or dislodge that question from saying, if you're not reading, you're not intellectually curious, or you're not being thoughtful. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just wondering, like, literally, like, why is it hard for your generation, do you think, or maybe just you, to really invest time in reading? Do you just feel like the payoff isn't commensurate with the effort?
I think it's because I'm so into trying to multitask.
Mm-hmm.
So listening to records or podcasts, it involves one sense, my hearing. But then I can use my other senses to do other things while I listen to it. And in case of audiobooks as well. Since I am a commuter to the university, every weekday for the past academic year, I drove, an hour-ish each way to go to class. And I would spend a lot of that time, say, listening to what I've been assigned to read.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like the ultimate multitasking. I'm driving so I can get to class, but I'm also reading to the stuff I was assigned.
Right. I wonder, and I've listened to audiobooks. I've never listened to audiobooks for teaching purposes or for research purposes. That is like in lieu of something else. So in lieu of reading for professional purposes. So I wonder about the usefulness of listening for the kind of work that happens in an English classroom. And when I say I wonder, I don't mean I doubt. I actually wonder because I know some students like to listen to audiobooks, and I don't have a problem with that. But I think that listening is fundamentally different from reading, most likely, and that we sort of, as you've already said, we sort of activate different parts of our brain doing one versus the other. And so is the work of the English major possible without reading? It might be. It might be that we're veering toward a world where we as English teachers need to get comfortable with the fact that what we call English does not have to be a book-centered discipline.
Right.
But it is right now.
Right. Like, what if we have an English major who's blind?
Oh, well, I taught a student who was visually impaired last semester, and it was. So I asked myself this question quite a bit because that student would listen to the material, was very faithful in that way, but it's difficult for a student who is visually impaired to maybe do the kind of close analytical reading.
The literal having your eyeball closer to the page.
No, not that kind of close reading, but the kind of reading where a poem, let's say, a poem requires sustained attention, rereading, and
sometimes attention being paid to the literal structuring of the words on the page.
Yes, also true. Yeah, and so that is simply unavailable to someone who's visually impaired. That doesn't mean that person has nothing to offer to a discussion. They might be more alive to the sound of a poem. They might be more alive to the rhythm of a poem because they are used to hearing things as opposed to looking at them. So there are advantages. But I do think that our discipline is fundamentally sort of sight-oriented.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's heavily dependent on that particular sense. And so a lot of what we expect people to do is coming from a sighted perspective. And so when people bring an oral perspective, AURAL, something they've listened to class, it doesn't always match up. And I'm not sure if that's a limitation of the discipline or if that's a limitation of sort of the oral reception of this material, that the discipline is what it is, and it sort of doesn't jibe with the audiobook. Audiobooks are great, but they're great for a number of things that don't include kind of literary criticism. So I think about that a lot, especially given what's happening with reading. People still read. They don't read long things.
They're mostly tweets.
Or articles. I mean, the site Medium, right, is sort of oriented around things that you can read in a specified amount of time. Like, this will be a 5-minute read. This is 1,000 words. It'll take you 8 minutes to get through. And to think about parceling out your time in those little bits and linking that up to the number of words in something is a very different experience from the kind of expansiveness of I'm going to sit and read a novel for however long it takes to read a novel. Or I'm going to read, I usually do page numbers myself. Like, I'm reading this book that I really don't like. I'm like, all right, I'm going to get through 40 pages today. and then I'll cheat and do 30. But I'm going to get through that. And that is not, I don't know how long that's going to take me because my attention wanders because I get bored. The other day I fell asleep. Right? And so the time was not easily, it was unstructured time in a way that I think people don't like to spend unstructured time reading. We still have unstructured time, but I don't know if we like to spend it reading in the way that perhaps we used to when we didn't have cat videos.
For some reason, I keep thinking I need a lot of unstructured time to, say, do some writing or reading to the point where, like, I don't have a job this summer. I really did think, even though I was taking, like, one online class that ran to, like, July, and then I did, like, some internship or something for a couple of weeks. Even though there was a lot of time, say in the first month of June when I was taking just this one class, sure, there's just a few things I have to do every week that's due on Sunday night. Beforehand, I kept thinking, man, I'm going to have all summer to I'll write 40 screenplays or something, or I'll write a bunch of essays or make a record. Mm-hmm. But then it kept, for one, I didn't do my work in a timely manner. But also, even if I did, which I didn't, I have this thing where it's, if I have one thing to do on a single day, that day revolves around that one thing, even if it doesn't take very long. I just, if I wake up that day, just like, oh, I'm doing that thing today. What am I going to do until then? And then it feels like, even if that thing is very brief, maybe only like 15 minutes, half an hour, I feel like, oh, so I can't do anything within an hour in each direction of the thing I've scheduled. Mm-hmm. Because, I have to get ready, and then, I have to if I'll have to leave the house, drive there, that takes a bit of time. Maybe I might have to be in a waiting room for a bit, fill out paperwork, say if it's a doctor's appointment or something. And then it becomes less about me thinking about the particular engagement I have scheduled, and more about the time surrounding the engagement where I have to think about all getting ready and leaving. My mind is occupied the entire day, and I don't get a lot done before then of anything I would wanted to have get done. Right.
That your problem I don't think is a unique one at all for people of lots of different generations, and I certainly don't have a solution, but one thing I learned when I was in graduate school, and I was reading all the time, and had to read a certain number of books for my doctoral exams, which were, let's say, a year away. So I took my exams in February of 2004. So February of 2003, I really started to crank up the reading. And I would say, okay, between 9 and 12 this day, I have to read X number of pages of, let's say, Moby Dick. So the schedule went backwards. If I have to read 100 books by next February, then what am I going to do today? And I had a schedule that mapped all this out, and I had to stay on the schedule, because if I got off schedule, well, then the reading was just going to start piling up, mm-hmm. right? And I'm the kind of person that doesn't like things to pile up. And so I would make sure that the first thing I did, I would take my son to the babysitter, I would drop him off, I would go to a cafe, I bought myself a coffee and a scone, because it's hard work reading Moby Dick. Mm-hmm. And so, and then I would spend as many hours as I needed to spend getting through those pages to check my box for the day. Mm-hmm. And so if your one thing to do for a day takes 15 minutes, you need more than one thing to do for a day. If your one thing to do for a day is read a third of Moby Dick, that's a day. I'm telling you right now, that's that's 200 pages of reading, and dense reading at that. And you're taking notes afterwards. And so what I learned in graduate school was both the discipline to sort of force yourself past the finish line. Like, if it says 200 pages, you got to read 200 pages. Mm. You can't cheat, because ultimately that cheating will tell. It will show up somewhere. I believe that. I believed it then. I believe it now. In all things. Like, if you cut this corner, you will know you cut that corner. And even if the professor never finds out, even if your committee never finds out, you'll know. And that bothers me. And the other thing I learned was there is no wasted time. As Thoreau says, as if one could kill time without damaging eternity. Meaning like if you're wasting, maybe Emerson. Okay, so
they're all the same.
I should know they're not all the same, but you can't just blow off 15 minutes and think that it has no impact. And I'm not accusing you. I'm talking about myself. Like I try to discipline myself in that way, saying like, these 15 minutes. If you're just scrolling through Twitter on your phone, and I'm not a big Twitter person, but it is a black hole. It's a black hole. Once you go on there, the time is gone. So I still, to this day, carry a book with me wherever I go and a pencil, because if I have 15 minutes, that's what I should be doing. I should be reading a book. I should be doing something that gets me closer to whatever my sort of, general goal is at that moment. And so in graduate school, I always had the book I was reading, always. And that meant, I've got 15 minutes to wait for a doctor's appointment, or my son's at the playground and he's happily engaged. Okay. Actually, he wasn't at that. He was less than a year old at that time, but this is a chance for me to do. And at the end of a day, and I'm sure you've experienced this, one always feels much better when you've produced, right? When you've you didn't just do that one thing, but you I'm really happy with the fact that I did this today. And when one takes stock at the end of the day, you're never happy with that time you blew off, right? And again, I'm not accusing you. I'm talking about myself. Like I cannot believe I wasted an hour doing that bullshit. Can we curse on this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. That's right. So that's.
You can say anything you want on here.
All right. So I try to remember that all the time.
You can curse, admit to a crime.
I'm not going to. I have no crimes to admit to. It's such a challenge, and your brain is wily. You can outsmart yourself. So if you give yourself a rigid to-do list, you can be like, well, I can, avoid that, do that tomorrow, and you just have to. You have to give yourself ample opportunities to be good, right? So for me, that means the computer and the phone, they stay in there. When I go sit in the spot where I read, my couch in my living room, those things stay away from me, because otherwise they'll be buzzing, dinging, calling me, demanding that I pick them up. And it's those challenges are there for everyone. I am grateful that I was raised in an era when I didn't have those distractions, because I see my children and I see people of your generation, and they've always had the distractions. And in a sense, they're just much more closely tied to the electronic world that we all inhabit now. And I feel like it's harder for people of your age and younger to break away than it is for people of my generation. I don't know if that's true, but I sense that it is, Do you feel that way? Like it's just hard to completely disconnect for an extended period of time?
Yes, at least now. But I remember I grew up in a time where I don't think I had an internet connection till I was maybe 10 years old.
Okay.
And I didn't get my first smartphone until I think I was 16 or 17. It was my senior year of high school.
Okay.
I remember before then, I had a lot of time that I did spend, say, reading, doing things that were more, where it seemed like I was more invested in the thing I was consuming, like a book, or literally just sitting in a room and listening to records and not doing anything else.
Not multitasking.
Yeah, not multitasking. Since then, I have felt that was probably the straw that broke my camel's brain, and now it just like I said, my consciousness is just splintered, and my brain is never where I feel like it should be. I yearn to perhaps train my brain to go back to that time.
That's really interesting. Monotasking versus multitasking, and so there's one key division between an older generation and this generation. And I would also say the idea of training our brains is, I really agree with you. even when the devices are over there, as I gesture to somewhere far away,
That's
still
Japan. That's Japan.
Right. But they're still with us.
Yeah.
Right. Like our brains, and there's been a lot of research on this. Have these devices rewired our brains? Do they activate certain pleasure sensors that we now need pinged for us in ways that only these devices can ping them? And so even when we put things away, we're still craving it, and that piece to me is troubling because I have felt the same kind of fog and the same kind of like inability to concentrate that I think you're describing. Not that we have the same experience, but we have sort of similar reactions. And I've talked to other people who have had the same feelings, and I didn't used to feel that way, and I don't particularly like it. So it's a strange situation where we are all sort of bound to these devices or technologies that seem not to satisfy, right? And yet most of us are still bound to them. It's a peculiar situation to be in because I don't remember this feeling of dissatisfaction to the same degree in an earlier moment. Like when I was monotasking, I never felt like, gosh, this just isn't great. But now that there's this device that takes my attention, it connects me to the world, but it also requires so much of me, that malaise feels much more present for me, and it feels widespread. Like, it's not just me. Everybody seems to be exhibiting traits of this, like, exhaustion and dissatisfaction. And I'm not going to lay that all at the device, at the feet of our devices, because we're participants in that. But it's peculiar. It's a peculiar time to be alive, having been alive in a different time, because you can feel the difference in yourself, and it's not pleasurable.
No.
Yeah. So the answer to that is, I always tell myself, like, we'll just get rid of the device. But then I think of
how much of you lives on that device.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have no answers on that one.
So we do have to read more Thoreau and Emerson, so we can.
My colleague Bill Major, who teaches in Hillier College and is one of my very good friends, does an experiment every year. He teaches Thoreau, where he says to students.
Oh, I thought you meant he lives in Walden.
No, no. Bill has a smartphone just like you, but Bill says to us, let's say he teaches on a Thursday. He said, "All right, we've read Thoreau. I'll give you extra credit if you give me your phones for the weekend. So we'll see you again on Tuesday. So you give me your phone for 5 days. I'll lock them up. I'm not going to look at them or anything like that. I want you to live without the phone. And tell me and you have to write about what you experience with that removal. Now, this isn't like going to Walden Pond, but in a sense, in the 21st century, it is, right? Yeah. Like just that very act of disconnecting is the beginning of a simplification and a removal from the mainstream that Thoreau wrote about. And Bill published this work in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. It's kind of an essay talking about students' experiences.
Now, is this available on audiobook for me?
No, you're going to have to Google it.
Okay.
It's called Thoreau's Cell Phone Experiment, but it's short. It's it'll take you 10 minutes.
Okay.
You can read it on your phone.
Okay.
But students record a sense of discomfort, and there's pervasive FOMO when you don't have a phone, right? Like, what's happening that I don't know about? But maybe that, like, learning to accept one's inability to experience everything. Like, life is FOMO. You're always missing out. There's always something cool going on somewhere that you're not partaking in, always. And so phones bring that to us and remind us of that fact. But what if we weren't reminded of it? What if it was like, hey, that's the way the world goes round. I'm doing this here. It doesn't matter what's happening somewhere else. I'll hear about it later.
Yeah.
So, I'm a believer. Benson, I'm gonna take that phone out in the parking lot and run my car over it. Except that it costs so much money, I just can't bring myself to do that.
Yeah.
But I do. The things that you're experiencing are things that I'm experiencing, are things that your classmates are experiencing, and they are fundamental. If someone who might be an English teacher someday, they are problems for how we do what we do.
Yeah.
It's just a straight up problem. And as people who are invested in language and words and reading and thinking, we all need to think about how do we adapt and where are our lines in the sand? Where do we say, no, we're not going there. We're not going to completely forego reading, or we're not going to completely abandon teaching texts longer than so many pages, or we're not going to, convert our class to, completely audiobooks or something like that. Do we have any lines? Do we lose something if we don't draw those lines? Like those are questions I think about a lot. My colleagues think about a lot, and the next generation of teachers are going to have to think about a lot. Good luck.
Yeah. You're from Virginia, right?
I was born in Washington, D.C., and I lived the first 4 years of my life in Maryland, and then moved to Virginia in 1979 when I was 4 years old. And so identify that was home. My parents still live there, and went through school in Virginia. So I think of Virginia as home.
So which part of Virginia?
I grew up in Stafford County, which is about 40 miles south of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So it's within the orbit of the capital, but it was, especially in the 70s, was far enough away that we were not part of the inner ring of suburbs. Now DC is much bigger. It's very different. Mm-hmm. Stafford is not a distant suburb. When I grew up there, it was a distant suburb. It'd be like living in, golly, I don't know, compared to New York, it would be, like living past where the train stopped.
Oh, okay.
Not in terms of distance, but in terms of sort of remoteness from the metropolis.
Right. Okay. And where'd you go to school?
You mean undergrad?
Yeah, undergrad.
Yeah, I went to the University of Michigan from 92 to 96.
In Ann Arbor?
In Ann Arbor, that's right. And wonderful experience. And I've been trying to get back to Ann Arbor ever since.
Back home again in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
Or back home again in Michigan. And then you went to, if I recall correctly, you went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for your graduate work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You earned your master's and your doctorate.
Yes.
There.
Yep.
In English.
That's right.
Yeah. All degrees in English.
All degrees, although, by the time you do a PhD, it's a little more specialized. So the master's in English, the PhD is in from the Department of English, but it's really focused on antebellum American literature, meaning, pre-1865 American lit.
Were you always a big reader growing up?
Yes. Yeah. I was a relatively early reader and a pretty voracious reader as a kid. And I always liked to think of myself as someone who read the classics, and would purchase books that were marked as classics when I was young, like at the book fair. Yeah. I would, that's what I sort of gravitated towards. And I didn't always read them all, but I did a lot of reading, like Charles Dickens and trying to think about other stuff. Mostly, like, I remember reading Dickens classics as a kid, and then read the standard kid stuff, Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and books like that. And I also just loved history, always have, still do, and read a lot of historical biographies of presidents and leaders, from around the world. Wars, military history interested me a great deal. And growing up in Virginia, there was both Civil War and Revolutionary history very close to me. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time reading about that, and baseball. I was and am a huge baseball fan, and now my son plays baseball, and we could talk about that together. So I read a lot of baseball books, both fiction and nonfiction, as a kid. And those are still the sections I go to in the library. I go to the history section. I go to the, I really don't read a lot of literature for pleasure anymore. For my pleasure reading is either sports, is nonfiction, either sports or history.
Can I ask, what influenced your decision to go to the University of Michigan?
My parents went there. Always wanted to go there.
Oh, okay.
So I'd applied to several schools as an undergraduate, and only three. Nowadays, people apply to 28 schools. I applied to three schools: Northwestern University in Chicago, University of North Carolina, and Michigan. And my parents deigned to drive to Chicago from Virginia so I could interview at Northwestern. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a sportscaster when I was in high school, and Northwestern had the best journalism school in the country, still does. A lot of ESPN folk who don't go to Syracuse go to Northwestern. A lot of sports journalists have gone there. And ultimately, I got into those all three of those schools, and I just had grown up with Michigan alums for parents, had always wanted to go to Michigan, had dreamed of going there, and did. So, that my reason for going was that I'd always just wanted to, as opposed to like feeling it like it was the best fit. I didn't feel that. It wasn't the best school. Northwestern's a stronger institution, at least in terms of the rankings. I mean, it's not a big difference, but I always just wanted to go to Michigan. So I did. And I have no regrets about that.
In my case, me choosing a place to go to school, it's more about, is it close?
Yeah. I did not want to be close to home. University of Virginia is an excellent school. Michigan, North Carolina, Virginia are all really good public institutions. And I wanted to leave Virginia. I did not want to be part of the fraternity scene at the University of Virginia because it's very old, white, Southern. And that is not my upbringing. And I was wary of that, even at age 17 when I went to college. So Virginia is an excellent school, but I did not want to be close to home. And I didn't want to see anybody from high school and college. I just didn't. And that mission accomplished.
When I say my criterion for choosing an institution is proximity, it's more because we don't have a lot of money to throw around for me to go to school,
sure.
Even really. But we also don't have like the time or money, and that would go into paying for housing, paying for driving me to or flying me to wherever I would have gone. That might have been far away, and I've never even lived anywhere outside of my hometown. It's always bemused me that, first of all, like people have the resources to go to school somewhere in some faraway land, but also that they would want to, I suppose, because one of my majors here is film, and as much as I would have liked to go to, say, the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, I also know that that's the exact opposite side of the country, and there would be just a whole mess in terms of logistics of getting there, getting my things there so I can live there while I go to school there, if I did go to school there. Maybe that's just a product of my circumstances, but I always felt just subtly jealous of people who would have the opportunity, the chance to do something like that.
Yeah. It's an amazing opportunity. And, my parents were both paid for college out of their own pockets. And in the 1960s, when that was much easier to do, I will say there are a variety of reasons that it is much more difficult to do now than it was for them, or even in my age. Like in my day, I could have conceivably, if I'd gone to an in-state school, paid my way through college. It would have been $5,000, $6,000 a year. And in 1992, that was doable. One could work a job and get $5,000 to $6,000 a year.
I remember reading something about when Ken Burns, the documentarian, he went to Hampshire College in Amherst, and it was many years ago, and he paid his way through school, but just by working at a record store.
Right. And
from what I could tell, it was probably part-time. But of course, that was back in a time when, tuition and such wasn't inflated.
Right.
And he was able to get by doing that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, institutions now they're structured very differently than they were in the 1960s. Some of that has to do with access, which is a really good thing. Some of that has to do with the fact that student services are so much more a central part of what institutions offer nowadays than they were before. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that state and federal government have really taken money away from universities deliberately, so that the burden of paying for school falls more and more on individuals as opposed to the collective. And my politics are very strongly collective oriented, and I think it's a shame that we don't do more for public education in this country. And this, of course, isn't a public school. I'm not talking about anything that would benefit me as a teacher, but just to benefit the populace. State institutions should be as close to free as possible for the residents of the state, period.
Yeah.
And we don't do that in Connecticut. We don't do that in most of the states of the country. So it was an extraordinary gift to be able to go away, to have those resources, through my parents. And I worked in college, but my parents paid my tuition. So, that's a huge benefit that not everybody has. The great thing about going away was in managing those logistics, though. So I left home at 17 and have never returned home except to visit, right? I've stayed away. And so I had to figure it out. I got sick, I had to go to the doctor.
You didn't even return home for the summer?
Okay. Oh, you're right. So 2 summers I returned home. So by age 19, I was done. My freshman and sophomore years, I came home. After my junior year, I got a job in Detroit. And senior year, got a job, same job in Detroit, and then got a full-time job. So I loved the independence that provided, and the sense okay, I can pay an electric bill. This is not rocket science, I can get my car fixed. I can figure this out. My parents and I have a very good relationship, and they were always supportive of me, including financially if there was an emergency when I was in college. But my goal, and this was the goal they gave me, was to be independent as soon as possible, both sort of physically, but also economically. And I'm fortunate that my parents did so much to help me. But it was always with the understanding that the tap was going to be cut off ASAP. And so I appreciate both those things, right? Their generosity and their insistence that the generosity had a hard stop at age 21 after 4 years of college. Everything else was my problem. And that's not to minimize the generosity, but the independence was a really crucial piece. So I liked going 12 hours from home. I didn't have a car until my senior year, and I couldn't get home. So my parents brought me home at Christmas every year, and that was it. So I loved that. I also loved going somewhere far, far away where I met a whole lot of people I'd never met before. So, for example, growing up in Stafford,
a smuggler,
Virginia,
or a princess,
no,
or a big walking
a Jewish
carpet.
person. Yeah, no, not like Star Wars, but it was a galaxy far, far away. I grew up in Stafford, and I didn't know a single Jewish person. And then I went to Michigan, which is almost 25% Jewish, and suddenly I knew a lot of Jewish people. And this was not a troubling thing. I wasn't raised in an anti-Semitic home. But I'd never met people who didn't sort of have a familiarity with Christianity and a Christian background. And I wasn't like a Bible thumper. I wasn't there trying to convert people. But that was my I'd always gone to church. I just thought, I imagined my experience as universal, which is not atypical for a relatively sheltered 17-year-old. But I was disabused of that notion very quickly. And so Michigan was a good school academically. I was surrounded by smart people, but the best thing about it is that it was a place where there are lots of different people. There were kids from Detroit, a largely African-American city, who were in my classes. I didn't have classes with African-American kids in Stafford. So I grew up white, Christian, sheltered, and educated parents. I didn't grow up in a home that was backward or Southern in sort of its politics. We weren't racists. And my dad's from New York, my mom's from Michigan, but I had no idea about the world, the people who inhabited it. And so for exposing me to that, I'm forever grateful to the university. It's just a remarkable place where I was forced to become a citizen in a very different way. And, that experience was not always comfortable, but it was extraordinarily valuable.
As someone who's currently an undergrad, and if I fall into teaching, because I will be having a degree in film and English, one of which I would say has some practical use that might have practical use. I might have to go to grad school to, say, get my master's so I could continue teaching. I've never really understood what it means to find a place to go to school again after earning a bachelor's, especially because, again, the logistics of not even like going to a place for undergrad that is like farther than an hour away from me. What influenced your decision, and what was your experience choosing and then matriculating at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill?
Well, that was after about 2 years out of undergrad. I knew that I wanted to go back to school. I felt like there were a lot of things that I wanted to know a great deal more about in terms of literary study. And then I began teaching. I taught high school for a year. So my first year of school, I was a writer for a software company in Cambridge, Mass. I moved there because my then girlfriend, now wife, is from Boston. She got a good job in Cambridge, so we moved to Cambridge, which is a great place to live. So worked as a tech writer for a year because I couldn't find a teaching job. Finally found a teaching job. Taught high school for a year, and after that year, I knew that I wanted to teach at a higher level. I enjoy teaching. I love it, but I did not want to be doing things like, say, getting Tony out of the bathroom because he was doing drugs in the bathroom, or teaching 7 pages of John Steinbeck's The Pearl at a time in my freshman English class. I was impatient. I was young and impatient, but I just didn't. I did not want to be responsible for those kind of things. I was interested in the work, and this classroom management stuff really grated on me quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So I started thinking, what do I want to study? I wanted to study Southern literature, and because I was from the South, and was really struggling at that time, in retrospect, to sort of figure out what it meant to be from the South, and because I'd gone to the North as for school, and people hated the South, and I was confused, because again, I said, well, my family's not, we're not in the KKK. We're not Confederate sympathizers. Why am I being teased and for being Southern? And I don't speak with an accent. I didn't then. I didn't think of myself as ignorant and don't now. So I was confused as to some of those stereotypes and became defensive about them. And so I really wanted to study Southern literature. Well, the best places to do that are, as you might be not be surprised to learn, are in the South, and especially University of North Carolina. Had a guy who teaches there named Fred Hobson, who was a really important figure in Southern Lit. There were other good schools, Vanderbilt, Georgia, Duke, that I applied to, and actually Boston University has a really renowned Faulkner scholar as well. So I applied to all of those places for graduate school. But UNC was always my first choice. And I had visited there when thinking about going to undergrad as well, and knew that I liked the place. So my wife got a job down there. We moved to North Carolina, and I taught school in North Carolina for a couple of years, thinking that my goal was to eventually go to school at UNC. And we loved living there. My wife had a great work situation. So when I got into UNC, I was extraordinarily gratified. So I would say that the reason I chose UNC in the first place was because I thought it would be a good fit for what I wanted to study, which, as it turns out, wasn't Southern literature. Right, that was the goal, but I didn't end up doing that. But the reason that I stayed and enjoyed it so much was because it was just a perfect situation for my family. Every person's situation is different. Again, I was married. I got married relatively young and was already married at the time I went to graduate school. So thinking about a situation where both my wife and I could realize our dreams professionally was important, and UNC provided that. And the other thing UNC provided was it was a top 20 PhD program, and that meant that I could get a job when I left. Lower ranked PhD programs simply do not place people in tenure track positions now, and they certainly, even in the 2000s, which was a better time to be hired as a professor, it was still really hard to get jobs. So I felt like I needed to go to a top program, and UNC was the best place I got into. So I didn't get into Duke, which but that's all right. I hated Duke already, and so the decision really was based on those two things, based on my family situation and based on my professional ambitions. Were I looking for a degree, like let's say I wanted to stay in the classroom as a middle school or high school teacher, I would go to the cheapest place around, right? Because the imperative would be different. I was going for a professional credential. You need a PhD to be a professor. I wanted to be a professor. This is the best chance for me to become a professor. And it worked, that part worked out. Mostly because of me, but a little bit because UNC helped. So every person's situation is going to be different in that respect. But like I said, if I had stayed in Massachusetts, loved teaching high school in Massachusetts, I would have gone to UMass Boston because it was cheap. Yeah. And they had a good program, and I would have gotten a master's degree there over the summers, and my high school would have paid for it. And that's how I would have chosen a program. Yeah. What's the least amount of fuss for me? But I wasn't, again, my situation was different at that time.
So the ambition was always to receive a doctorate so you could begin teaching at a university level, right?
Yeah, after a couple of years of public school teaching, yeah, that was my ambition.
Forgive me if I'm wrong, but so the usual progression for people is like bachelor's, master's, and then a PhD. But you don't necessarily need a master's to get a PhD, right?
Different programs do it differently. UNC still gave a separate master's and PhD, but when they admitted me to the program, the assumption was that I would continue for the PhD. I was admitted to the graduate program, and you have to fulfill certain requirements for a master's degree, but they always assumed that I and my classmates, there were 16 of us who were admitted to the program, actually 12. I think 5 people came in already with masters. The end goal was the PhD. Some people left. Some people decided this isn't for me, and they left with a master's. But that was why we were admitted. Some schools don't even do a master's. I think Duke is actually like this. It's a 5-year PhD program, so they admit you with a bachelor's degree, and they want you out as soon as possible with a PhD. And they really try to, at least at that time, they really tried to push their students along to get through in 5 years. Maybe 6.
Right, okay. As someone who is in a program to receive a certification to teach, I'm trying to learn more about the ins and outs of what that means. Because from what I can tell, from what I've heard but never confirmed, because I don't think I can, for some reason I look for the information, say online, but I can't find it. If I got my undergrad degree in English, along with that certification, I could begin teaching in high school. That's what the certification is for.
Yes.
For secondary. But then it's, at least in the state of Connecticut, where I live, it's assumed that you are required to earn your master's degree, but does it have to be a master's in education?
No.
It doesn't?
No.
Because if I were, I don't want to say relegated to teaching, but let's face it, me with a degree in film trying to break into show business, that's probably not going to work out. If I were to be a teacher for most of my time, I was thinking I would, sooner or later, I will graduate with my bachelor's in film and English, and then maybe not want to stay teaching secondary education for a long time. And so I had this plan that if the thing I thought was correct, in that the master's degree you earn to continue teaching need not be in education or even related to the field in which you teach at the school, then maybe I would get a master's degree in film production and then continue to get a PhD in English. So at the university level, I could feasibly teach both film and English.
I mean, it all depends on the university.
Yeah.
And whether that kind of credentialing would work. I will say that I think the key, so a master's degree is a master's degree in terms of,
I have mastered the craft.
Right. Well, in terms of your tenure ability in a public school.
Right.
You know, like to have a permanent certificate, you need to have a master's. And the subject area, to my knowledge, does not matter. The issue is, or might be, whether or not your school will pay for it. And if your school is going to pay for it or even help pay for it, probably they're going to want you to be getting a master's in the subject area that you teach at that school or in education. So while any master's would work for purposes of increasing your pay and of allowing you to have a permanent certificate, it might be that whoever's paying for the degree will have something to say about that. Of course, if you pay for your own degree, nobody could say anything. But one of the attractions of having a job and then going back for a master's is that oftentimes whatever job you have will at least contribute to that credential. So that could be one stumbling block for that plan. Otherwise, though, it's a great way to sort of combine your long-term ambitions with your short-term situation. If there are programs in film production here in Connecticut.
Yeah. There is one graduate film program at Sacred Heart University, which was actually co-founded by Justin Lieberman, who he was here for a couple of years teaching film.
The late lamented Justin Lieberman.
He was a program director of the cinema program. It's called Cinema here. That's the nomenclature. So there's one that I know about. And then, of course, all the like Columbia's and the whatevers that are like, or USC, any big film school where people go to do undergrad probably also have graduate programs. But of course, given my limited resources or penchants for going more than 20 miles from my house, I would think if I were really serious about earning a master's in film production, it would probably be at Sacred Heart University.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, ideally, if you had a job, you could move somewhere closer to Bridgeport because then you'd have the resources to afford an apartment or something like that, and that would make it easier. You know, if you taught and went to school closer to Bridgeport, that would make your life easier than commuting from where you are now. I guess you're a little closer to Bridgeport and Torrington, but it's still a pretty long haul.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I gotta get my life together, guys. Brian, I don't know what to do in my life.
Yeah. Well, you're young. You've got time to figure that out.
Youngish.
Yeah. I didn't know either for a while.
Huh?
You know, like I would say late 30s. Kind of when I knew what I wanted to do. So you got a little time. You just need to pay the bills until then.
I'm 23, Brian. The time is dwindling.
No, you've got seriously long time. I didn't even get this job till I was in my 30s. So,
yes, but I will graduate with a bachelor's degree and have no health insurance. So
you can be on your parents' plan until 25 now, right?
26.
Oh, okay.
Which is when I will be graduating.
Oh,
right. So.
But you're going to get a job as soon as you graduate, so you don't have to worry about that.
Am I?
Yeah.
But we can't know for sure. These make me reflect too much on myself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This makes for great radio, guys. A guy just feeling sorry for himself.
You can edit that out.
No, I tend to keep all of it in.
Anything else?
No.
No, you're good?
We keep going if you want.
That's fine with me. If you have other questions, I'm happy to.
I mean, I don't come with questions prepared, really.
Or if other questions have occurred to you.
No, not at the moment. All the questions I ask, other than say, where are you from and where'd you go to school, they're all in the moment. There are no prepared questions here. Right. Because I do want this to be more. This was the first 2/3 of this, or more, where that was really what I strive for, where it's just us talking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was much more freeform.
Pontificating upon whatever.
Yeah.
Because, so this is interview-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't necessarily want it to be an interview.
Mm-hmm.
More like an interview station.
Right.
Because, do you even recall if I hit record?
No, I didn't see you hit record, but
I mean, I don't like the when people do like real official interviews. It's all hey, we have Bryan Sinche
Right.
on the other end here.
Right.
So, welcome. And make a real big show about hitting record and such. It puts people on guard. And they're like, they put their walls up. It's like, it's time to interview. But of course, I want the energy to be very casual and not so much one-sided. Because when we think of interviews, it's the interviewer. They could literally not be there. You could just hold up the sheet of questions, and then the interviewee will answer them. In the end, they're just reading the questions. I do want there to be a back and forth,
Right.
But I think, it went okay.
All right.
Went okay.
We're done?
We could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Ooh, those two make you a little hot.